I appreciate you all joining us tonight for our final Cultural Heritage Month series. My name is Demetrius Jaggers, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Senior Director of the Dowdy Multicultural Center. I'm here to thank you all for joining us this evening for our Asian Pacific Islander Desi American Heritage Month speaker event, a continuation of our Cultural Heritage Month speaker series. This event is sponsored by the Dowdy Multicultural Center. APIDA Heritage Month is a time for us to honor and recognize the achievements, triumphs, and culture of Asian, Pacific Islander, and Desi Americans in the United States. This month, we learn and commemorate the pivotal role the APIDA communities have played in our nation's history and express our appreciation for their cultures. This evening, our featured speakers include Christina Wong and Simran, Jeet, Singh, which will highlight the rich diversity and history of Asian Pacific Islander and Desi American communities in the U.S. Our speakers will also connect racial justice movement across the APIDA communities and specifically discuss the ongoing racism that is impacting APIDA communities, both in the U.S. and abroad. Following this talk, there will be a question and answer session moderated by myself. A few technical notes before we get started this evening. Please be sure that you are muted, and we also encourage you to use speaker view throughout the session. Throughout this event, you may submit questions in the chat to be asked during the Q&A session. And we did have a lovely student who was planning to be here. I'm checking in with her to make sure she didn't have any technical difficulties. She was actually going to introduce our special guest, but unfortunately she is not here with us. But Lauren Gaston, who is a junior, she's an exercise science major with a minor in psychology. She's involved with the peer mentoring program in the Dowdy Multicultural Center. She is also a member of Delta Sigma Theta, and she is a program assistant in the Dowdy Multicultural Center. So because Lauren isn't with us, I am going to just ask Kristina and Simran to provide their introductions in their opening comments. And so we'll start off this evening with Kristina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Wong. I'm right now in Koreatown, Los Angeles, which sits on the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva, Gabrielino, Chumash, and Kizh peoples. I am an elected representative in Koreatown, but I'm also a performance artist and comedian. And how that all happened was years ago in election, November 2016. Before that point, I had a reality television show pilot where I was going to play a character named Christina Wong. That's my name, who was like a self-satirizing activist character. And once Trump took office, this sort of satirical character that I played of myself that was like lovingly poking fun of myself as an activist, doing these sort of stunts that I had been doing in my body of work as an artist anyway, made no sense. It was hard to satirize what was already a world that was looking like a headline from The Onion. And I, as someone who used to turn to a lot of comedy and satire and pranking to make my points, found myself like unable to figure out how to confront the strangeness of the world. And I said, you know what? I'm just going to run for office because politicians and artists have switched jobs. They're now the clowns and the ones who are making life absurd. And we clowns who used to like make fun of the straight man are left to like fill the void and hold the space for social change. And I thought, well, if these politicians are going to take my job as a change maker, or as a crazy maker, I'll I'll take their job and make a show called Christina Wong for public office. So that's the set you see behind me. I ran actually in 2 small elections. I won locally here in Koreatown for a neighborhood council seat where I'm basically the representative of my sub-district, the half square mile I live in Koreatown. The neighborhood council is mostly an advisory committee, so I can't defund the police. I can't just show up to a meeting to fund the police or like in one fell swoop, like end ICE, though we do symbolically create gestures and vote on things. You can hear Koreatown maybe through my speakers. It's a very Koreatown siren sound. It's very Koreatown. But anyway, the idea was I created this rally show. I saw my set pieces, and I was really fascinated with looking at how political campaigns were like these crazy, absurd spectacle theater shows. And it was going to be the story of how I ran for office in Koreatown and how I wanted to make change, and ultimately ended up leading my neighborhood council to vote to abolish ICE. It was a symbolic vote because we're an advisory council again, and we can't take down a federal agency from these unpaid seats that we serve in neighborhood council. And that was all. I wear a white suit and do that. And now you see my set in my house, not because I'm so obsessed with my career that I need to look at my set all the time, but because my tour was canceled at the top of the pandemic. And I had to just like, that's my kitchen back there, right? I had to basically take this set, which I sewed on a Hello Kitty sewing machine and design myself and translate it for Zoom. So so that happened in March, and I was able to tour the show quite a bit from my house. And you know, instead of having a blank empty room, I was telling stories from the kitchen on the floor and from the house, but in costume. But something else also happened at the top of the pandemic is there weren't enough masks on the market, face masks. And there was, the crazy thing is I wasn't even wearing a face mask myself, because this mask I can't take off was making me a target for hate and violence. And as soon as this virus had come out from China, it was given nicknames, as we know, like by the then president of the United States / social media influencer. It was given names like Kung Flu, the China virus, names that for me as a Chinese American were alarming, because my whole life I've experienced people not being able to separate a Chinese American like myself, who's lived in this country, whose family has been here for 3 generations, which means my parents were born here, my grandparents came to San Francisco as teenagers, from people who recently arrived, and can't tell the difference between those people from a virus that had its original cases in China. And this recent wave, or not recent wave, but I guess this ongoing wave of hate and violence was expected. And when it finally not finally, there will be more, but when it culminated in this mass shooting in Atlanta, I don't think it came as a huge surprise to a lot of Asian Americans who have felt our whole life like we've been the other, that we're used to getting mixed up with the other Asian person in the room, that we're used to having to present and explain to people what we're doing here, or answer questions like, oh, what are you? Before we can just tell you ourselves or introduce ourselves to whoever on our own terms. So so the point of all that was I wasn't wearing a mask, and yet I saw that there was a need for homemade masks. Now I sew my set pieces. I've sewn things that are not medical in use. I've sewn this giant vagina costume where my face is the clitoris and the labia, but I'd never sewn medical equipment before. But there was a need for hospitals to have masks. So I got my Hello Kitty sewing machine and I started to sew masks using a pattern I found on the internet and some scraps of fabric, and offered naively to the internet, if you're immunocompromised or an essential worker, or you just need a mask, let me know, because there were none on the market. Stuff from Amazon was taking like months to come over. I end up having to start a group called the Auntie Sewing Squad, which is still active 13 months into the pandemic, and we sew masks for very vulnerable communities. It started initially for like whoever really needed them. And then it became clear, the idea we were thinking we were only going to be around for 2 or 3 weeks, and then the government would just step in and offer help. And at that moment when I had offered to make masks, it wasn't supposed to be about social justice or political or anything. It wasn't even an art project. It was just like, let's help, like, let's make this virus go away in a couple months by protecting as many people as possible. And then it became a political thing. It became masks are your choice. This is something Trump had said. Certain governors in certain states going, we don't need a mask mandate. And it became very political. And my mask making group consists of hundreds of mostly Asian American women who've inherited their sewing skills and survival skills from their mothers and grandmothers who worked in sweatshops and as garment workers. My own grandparents had a laundry in San Francisco and did alterations. And we've been sewing these masks, and it's been a way to express our allyship to different communities. We've sewn for protesters of Black Lives Matter who didn't have access to masks. We've sewn a lot for Indigenous communities, for farm workers, for migrants at the border. And at this point, even though there are cheap masks on the market, we don't have, we are able to express our allyship and our support of these other communities by sewing masks and sending them straight to the communities that need them, who can't access masks any other way. I want to point that one of the big ironies of this mask making group, which I sort of stumbled into, is over a year ago in the pandemic, one of the first batches I sewed was for Srinya. Cool. She's the first Asian American firefighter in New York. Her firehouse was down to the last 5 N95s. And I was like, I can do this. Very heroically, like running to the post office and sewing these. A year later, she is now doing, she sent us self-defense kits. This consists of this like spike, I can run and get it. It's like the spike to basically come at attackers with, right? This little charming thing, and this thing which I thought, I wasn't sure what this was. I knew it was an alarm, and I was like, how does this work? I'm supposed to like shine a light at an attacker, but you pull this and its alarm goes off. And so the irony is not lost on me that a year ago we were trying to protect people from a virus, and a year later the same people we were trying to protect are now sending us things to help the Asian aunties in our group not be killed in the street by a racist who wants to harm us. And so our group has evolved. The Auntie Sewing Squad has evolved from being a mass sewing group to, we now have a white ally group that meets within our group. We've done a self-defense course within our group, and we're talking a lot about race and stuff, which is like really beyond the scope of how a lot of people think about sewing groups, right? A lot of folks think of sewing groups as apolitical. So that's all the topic of this new show that I'm working on, called Christina Wong Sweatshop Overlord, which has been sort of reflecting on this time and these multiple pandemics that we're living in. And I'll pass it to Simran.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. It was super interesting, and definitely not as cool as you, and not as funny as you, but I'll I'll try. I born and raised in Texas. My parents immigrated from India, and one of the strange things about my upbringing was being the only family in all of South Texas who wore turbans, and it's part of our cultural and religious heritage. And so, I mean, just imagine, I have 3 brothers, so the 4 of us with our brown skin and our turbans running around South Texas. Like it was interesting is probably a good word to use for that. And we had all kinds of run-ins with racism from childhood. I have memories from preschool. I have memories from elementary school, middle school, like all throughout. And so we were very familiar with racism from a young age, and different kinds of racism, right? There was the malicious, go back to where you came from, with a couple of extra adjectives tacked on. There was the gentle pointing out of our difference, right? Like people just saying, hey, what's that thing on your head? Why do you wear it? Where's your family from? And then there was also the sort of what we call institutionalized racism, where we would show up to places and they would have policies that said, you don't belong here. You can't hang out here, right? Roller skating rinks, basketball games, like that's, I mean, that was my brothers and I were huge into sports growing up. And I remember really vividly having arguments with referees, right? Like, so imagine a 10-year-old kid trying to convince a grown man that I should be allowed to play with my turban on because that's what's fair. And he says, well, that's not in the rules. And the problem was, he was right. Those were the rules. That's institutionalized discrimination, right? You have these rules that are set up when there aren't people at the table making the decisions who look like you or who know people like you. And so there's a trickle-down effect, right? I was really affected as a kid by these rules that no one meant to exclude me, but the impact was brutal as a kid. My older brother missed his entire freshman year of basketball because the Texas state governance for sports wouldn't let him play. My younger brother was the first to play NCAA basketball. He had to get the rules changed. I had to get the United States Soccer Federation to change. I mean, this isn't just hey, one time I show up somewhere and I'm kicked out. It was like a common everyday experience. And so that really informed my life growing up. And, you know, it wasn't, you know, all I ever thought about, right? Life was normal growing up in Texas. I had 3 brothers who were hanging out all the time, sports, classmates, like it was genuinely, sincerely fun across the board. And then I was about y'all's age. I was a senior in high school when 9/11 happened. And I remember standing in my history teacher's classroom with some friends and watching the TV. And I mean, we were silent. We were horrified, you know, attacked as Americans. We were devastated. And then they start showing pictures of the primary suspect, Osama bin Laden. And you all know as well as I do, he looks just like me. I mean, not really, but he has a turban and a beard and a brown skin. And I knew my friends around me would have my back. They'd shown it over and over again in the past. I wasn't really concerned about that, but I also knew that most Americans wouldn't see me as one of them. They'd see me as one of bin Laden's people. And that's exactly what happened. That was a turning point in my life. And, you know, I was coming of age as a person, right? Moving into adulthood, thinking about what I wanted to do with my life. And here I have this life-changing moment where racism really comes home to roost. Like we didn't leave our house for days. We had death threats called in, people driving by, like all sorts of stuff. And it was real. People we knew were getting attacked and killed. And I realized then, and I didn't have this exact language for it, I realized then that I could no longer just ignore the racism that came my way, that it was a matter of life and death, that if I didn't do something, then people I knew would continue to be killed, including people that I loved. And so that's what put me on the path to what I do now. I'm a scholar. I'm a racial justice activist. I work a lot in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, and it's really about, for me, justice and equity, but it's also really about survival, right? Thinking about what happens to communities when they are marginalized, and then these moments of tension bubble up, like we have right now against Asian Americans. These moments of tension bubble up, and all of a sudden it's uncontrollable, right? Like, and then we try and react, and it's already too late. Like, people are being killed, communities are being devastated, and that's when we try and, you know, put together resources and develop something. No, it's too late at that point. So my life has become devoted to building more in advance. What does it look like for us to create conditions, to create an environment where we're more inclusive, where we're more accepting, and less willing to turn on each other the moment that we feel scared and fearful? And so that to me is part of the vision and what put me into the work that I do now.
Well, thank you both for those introductions and for giving us a bit of a background and context about the framework and perspective that you bring to this conversation tonight. And so I want to go ahead and just jump right into our first question. We have a series of questions that have been prepared. However, again, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers later on this evening. So the first question for you all is, what are some of the racial and social justice issues that specifically impact APIDA communities that are not addressed or covered in mainstream media?
We don't have enough time for all this, but I can popcorn a few of them. I mean, right now is this epidemic of violence that we're dealing with, and I'm glad I'm on this discussion with Simran, because I want to note I'm East Asian and Simran is South Asian, and I would say that I feel like Simran, you've probably experienced more of the like life or death, like walking through the street stuff, and that's a fairly newish thing for me. It's been mostly a series of microaggressions my entire life that never directly like put me in a place where I would be afraid to walk to CVS or walk to wherever. And I'm just kind of reckoning that this is a real moment right now for a lot of East Asian people, maybe of my age and younger, who have dealt with BS our whole lives, but never like direct violence out of nowhere, and having to witness it over and over again happen, like on the street in these videos with our elders or our own, and witness our own family members deal with this. So I want to point out there's just a difference and yet intersections between our experiences. There's issues around immigration. A lot of 1 in 7 Asian Americans is undocumented. A lot of Southeast Asians who are up for deportation and have been deported. And that doesn't get seen as an Asian American issue. Simran, do you want to jump in with any? I'll just keep throwing them out.
Yeah, sure. I mean, immigration's a huge one, and it's one that I spend a lot of time working on, both because of the undocumented situation, but also because of how many Asian immigrants come as political asylees. And I think that's something that we in the States don't think about or talk about. The mass displacement and refugee crisis so often incorporates Asian Americans, and we don't think about them as refugees in our society, and they are, right? And you know, my wife's family came as political refugees, escaping political violence in India. If you look at the kinds of mass ethnic cleansing happening in the world today, some of the worst cases are in Asia, right? We can look at the Rohingya in Myanmar. We can look at the Uyghurs in China. And those are in our lifetimes, 2 of the worst genocidal violent cases of genocidal violence that we have seen. And we don't hear a thing about them on the media, on the news. And so that's one to me that, on the one hand, right, we can say, well, it's not an American story, it's an international story. But I think there's something that goes a little deeper than that, which is, if we ask ourselves, why don't we care about these people? Who do we choose to care about and who do we not care about? A lot of times it boils down to race and racial justice, right? The same way that this white supremacy works to make us think, whether consciously or unconsciously, that whiteness is more important than blackness. That's the same logic that comes into our minds when we're thinking about whiteness and American lives being more valuable than lives in Myanmar or in China. And so that to me, I think, really is a racial justice issue, if we're able to sort of shift our lens a little bit to really understand what's going on. Back to you, Kristina.
Yeah, I just finished a project this past weekend with East-West players with formerly incarcerated Asian Pacific Islander Americans. So when we think about who's impacted by the criminal justice system, we mostly think of brown and black bodies. But the Asian American population in prison is very small. It's difficult to count because it's often counted as other. And so sometimes there's just no numbers and no data on Asian American prisoners. But a lot of those prisoners, when they do get out, there's a lot of issues of shame around their incarceration. So some of the stories, like the cast members in the project were formerly incarcerated. Some of their families don't talk to them anymore. They actually had to erase them and told the other family members, oh, so-and-so's traveling, so-and-so's in the military, still just hasn't come back. That's very real, but a lot of them are facing deportation and are subject to issues of access inside the prison. They can't access translation or maxi pads or medical care, basic things that they do have rights to even as inmates. So that is something that I felt so historical as we were just creating this theater piece on Zoom and put forward, because not even Asian Americans know about or think about this. Because even if there are Asian Americans in our families who are incarcerated, our families haven't told us about them because they did something bad and that's super shameful. And that's another sort of theme that sort of colors a lot of how Asians react or participate in activism, is this tendency to like want to avoid shame as much as possible, to avoid embarrassment, and to not do things that rock the boat. And I'll just say, I'll use it in I terms. I don't know if Simran's experience is different, but for me, as someone who's Chinese American, I definitely think shame is a huge thing that has colored everything. And now this is a turning point in which we decide whether or not we can move past this shame and actually do something about it so that we don't die. Because we're really in like a life or death kind of moment right now, with the way racism is manifested.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And there's one other aspect that's coming to my mind as I'm hearing you speak, Kristina, and that's as you were talking about erasure. I can't help think, I'm a historian, I'm a nerd, you can see all the books behind me. I can't help but think about the erasure of history, right? Like, why is it that I was 30 years old when I first learned about the Chinese Exclusion Act? Like, we learned about Japanese internment, but in my head, that was an isolated incident, right? Like, if you think about how we're taught history in our schools, right? Growing up in Texas, you learn about Japanese internment and you're like, oh, well, Americans made a mistake. It's anomalous. It's never going to happen again. It never happened before. But then you start looking at history, right? Like as I got older, and you realize that these kinds of violence against Asian Americans, beginning with the first wave of Chinese immigrants in the States more than 150 years ago, I mean, it's the same story over and over again. And so to me, one of the real, back to your question, Demetrius, of like, what gets missed? It's also a question of what's the cost of missing these stories? The cost is we never overcome them, right? Like the same stories we're hearing about, or the same stereotypes we're hearing about East Asians being dirty, filthy, more prone to disease. That's not new, right? We can tell ourselves every 10 years that it's new. I mean, it happened with the SARS outbreak like 10 years ago or so, 15 years ago. I remember that when I was a bit younger, but like even then that wasn't new. That's been going on for decades and more than a century now. So to me, the cost of not learning our lesson, and this is like the cliche that we hear about history, we just keep making the same mistakes over and over again, and they're really costly mistakes.
Yeah, I want to echo that, and I'm glad you're reminding us like how important are who's writing the history. And I want to point to Corky Lee, who is a photographer who we recently lost. He self-proclaimed a photo laureate of Asian America. He recently passed away of COVID-19. And he got into photojournalism because he looked at a photo of the final spike being set at the Transcontinental Railroad. There are thousands of Chinese railroad workers, but none of them were in the picture. And that's how easy it is to rewrite history. I mean, I remember having complete disassociative stuff as a kid, watching black and white TV shows like Lassie and Leave It to Beaver. My grandparents had been in America at that time, but they weren't on that show. So it was almost like we didn't exist. And I could only identify, with the characters that I saw, and just had I knew we were there. I knew we were there years ago, but it was almost like we're not real, we're not there. And I was also on a panel with NYU librarians who pointed out to me, like, in my mind, I had thought for many years, like, that history was sort of this objective thing that was just like stuff is made and it's just all collected. But even within the science of library stuff, there's a lot of bias. It's actually more male apparently than female. So that like totally like was a whoa. I always imagined like, you know, the lady librarian. But there's so much that has to, there's so many hands that track history, and if we don't have a, you know, a copy of that, we're not able to reflect who we are or who other people are.
Thank you both. That's actually a really perfect segue into the next question. And you all may have touched a bit on it, but I'll just go ahead and read it. In the past 12 months, there has been an increase in anti-Asian racism and violence across the U.S. How do these current incidents of bias, violence, and discrimination fit within a larger narrative of racism and white supremacist ideologies in the U.S. and abroad?
So much. It's not new. I'm not the historian here, but it does go back, and Simran, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but to 1875, the Page Act, which was the headliner for the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese women were really targeted because they're seen as prostitutes. And while some were prostitutes, it fed into this whole idea as when Asian women are in America, they're sexualized. That's what they're here for. And it also cast Asian Americans as bearers of disease. And Angel Island was a stop point or checkpoint for Chinese American immigrants, where they were sort of checked for disease and asked these impossible questions before they could enter America. And they would do medical tests on them. South Asian immigrants were turned away because they had things like hookworm that were easily treatable. But it was just all this justification of like, whatever can we do to send them back? And you see this narrative happening at the Mexican border with migrants there who are seeking asylum, that's, oh, they have disease, they're rapists, they have crime, they're just like, they aren't humanized, and just seen as bad, this is like this bad pestilence that's moving across the border to penetrate our like lily white country. There's more. Simran, I would love for you to, because I can name more events in history.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think it's right on point. And I think, I mean, to approach the question in another way, Demetrius, like, how does this fit into a larger context of American history, of Western history? I mean, I think what we have to understand is that America was founded on racism. And it's the story that's it's confusing to somebody who's born and raised here, right? Like, I understood America as racism, but it was so difficult for me to unravel and to reconstruct this story that had this beautiful aspiration of liberty and justice for all, and at the same time was built on the backs of slaves, right? Like, it makes no sense. But it does, because that's our world. And when we can understand that both things can be true, we can aspire for greatness and we can also suck. We can also be racist, and we are. It's critical that we recognize that. And so for me, one of the things that seems increasingly important, you know, growing up in Texas, dealing with racism every day and not having anyone around who looked like me, one of the feelings that I had constantly was, no one understands what I'm going through. Like, no one's, I mean, that's one of the greatest tricks of white supremacy. It segments everybody and makes you feel so isolated, as if you are the only person in the world who's going through this. And one of the big changes, and I think this is really helpful, right? Like, we've talked a little bit about the vertical connection across history, but we can also look horizontally. And I think that's what our society is doing really well right now, to say, oh, this Asian hate is somehow connected to anti-Blackness. Oh, this Asian hate we're seeing is intersecting with misogyny in some way. That homophobia might intersect with another kind of oppression. And now what we have is an understanding that I didn't have growing up, that these kinds of violence are all connected both historically and presently. And so I think, and this is what gives me hope, there is a growing understanding among younger generations in particular, that these things are all connected. And I think once we can do that, then we can start, like, this idea of intersectionality can really help us understand the systemic challenges that we encounter and begin dismantling those, and then going down to the daily provocations that we all have. So yeah, just a different way of approaching the question of what are the connections here. But yeah, Christina, I wonder if that resonates.
What resonates is that sort of the way we've defined what racism is. It's like always these spectacular theatrical things. It's someone literally saying, I hate, this race of people. I hate that. And I think in our narrative about like fearing this word racism, we've learned to just like, don't use the N-word. Don't go around saying you hate people. And we've learned to disguise. And I say we because I think there is a complicity in this for all Americans who've, of all colors, who've figured out ways to pass. And sometimes that passing means turning on the next group of people who come in who are new and finding someone else to point the finger at so it's not you. And I think what was interesting about the Atlanta shooting is that the police were like, well, he says it's not racially motivated. It was just a sex addiction. And it's like, I think that's the thing with Asian Americans. There aren't, it's trickier to report hate crimes because sort of the signifiers around how a hate crime has to be expressed have to be so blatant. Like, it's almost like this person had to kick open a door and say, I hate Koreans and Chinese people, and that's why I'm shooting you, pow, pow, right? And that's not how these things play out, right? Like, yes, it's a sex addiction, but what about him made him think that Asian women were this thing tempting him? Like, what is that? Like, that's a racist notion, right? That comes from a long historicized portrayal of Asians as Asian women as these sexual things, right? That are there for your disposal and consumption. So that's what, when I was agreeing, Simran, when you were describing like what's intersectional, and sometimes we think it's this, but we actually have to look at all the layers of it. But I think the issue that we're having as a country is that like we need such blatant ways to describe things that I think we've learned how to avoid, right? And that it's so much more seeped and embedded in us.
Yeah, exactly. And I could talk for days about hate crime legislation and how the laws work and how they don't work more than they work. But there's one thing I wanted to say before throwing it back to you, Demetrius. Your point about the fetishization of Asian women, I think, there's a way of thinking about that where if you're not an Asian woman, you're like, that doesn't pertain to me. I don't need to think about that. But there's something really relevant here that I want to point out. And maybe a good way to tie it in is through conversations around cultural appropriation. Because a lot of the arguments for cultural appropriation, people will say, well, I'm not being racist, I'm celebrating this culture.
Yeah.
I'm fetishizing, or I'm fetishizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm doing something, it's not racist if it's positive.
Mm-hmm.
And what we know from this, both through history and through our own experiences, Christina, is that racism can still be incredibly harmful. And
Mm-hmm.
the deadly killings in Atlanta are a really good example of what happens when you allow and enable a culture to exoticize another culture. You're still flattening them, you're dehumanizing them, you're
Mm-hmm.
creating stereotypes that are ultimately seen as inferior.
And you're making people disposable or interchangeable. Yeah.
No, so I think it's such an important point. It's one I've been thinking a lot about since those killings in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of my satire had revolved around for many years yellow fever, and people were like, well, what's wrong if I just have a thing for Asian women? And what's wrong is you're not seeing me. You're engaging with your perception of my race and not who I am as a person. And when does that escalate? It takes that plus China flu, plus a guy with a sex addiction, and suddenly, people's grandmas are getting beat up in the street, and people are just rendered invisible and helpless and meek, and it's synonymous with all these other flattened kind of images.
So thank you all for the great discussion. And there are a lot of themes that you all kind of talked about, and specifically, one of the themes that I want to try to connect is particularly related to this idea around anti-Blackness and also the ways in which tension is created when we don't view white supremacy as the culprit, right? So can you all maybe talk a little bit more about how, or the need to coalition, to build solidarity across not just APIDA communities, but also broader Black and Brown communities as well?
I mean, that's what I have so many things to say about this. I feel like as I'm witnessing the Asian American community, like I went to a Stop the Hate rally. For me, it's a very tricky way of phrasing it that doesn't feel sustainable. This movement is, yes, we want to stop hate crimes, but what really that gets at is like, who are we rallying against? These theoretical people who are going to beat us up, or a bigger system of racism? And then how do you break down that system, right? And so that feels so I definitely feel like this Stop the Asian Hate movement is trying to find itself, and the organizers, who I think are really savvy about it, are doing the right things, which is connecting us to Black Lives Matter, and to connecting us to other social justice movements, and making clear that the work of social justice has been carried out a lot by Black and Brown and Indigenous activists, and Asians have, for the most part, benefited a lot without having to carry as much of the labor. And now, as I'm watching these marches, I'm like, oh my God, this is like a first all Asian march, or mostly Asian march for a lot of us. And I'm seeing all lives matter signs and Asian lives matter signs. And I don't think that the people holding the signs intended to co-opt Black Lives Matter, but I just don't I think they're thinking singularly in like, we matter too. I get the thinking, but for me, my urging is we need to really kind of, if we're looking at something sustainable, we have to kind of think about how to build community, how to move away from the first response being, okay, we're being hate crime, let's call the police to patrol the community more, and just arrest people, because that doesn't shift structurally why these things are happening. I have just so many opinions on this, but I feel like we are a fledgling, not fledgling like we're going to fail, but I am witnessing this right now, and I'm witnessing community organizations here in Koreatown. One came to our neighborhood council meeting for funding, and they wanted to put out brochures in Korean and Chinese and whatever that like that made you aware of, this is a hate crime and this is how you call the police. And a lot of us on the council, it's like, while we want to help address the hate crimes, it was like, it just felt like papers that were going around to just alarm people, like, you're going to get hurt, you're going to get hurt, and when you do, scream for help and call for the police. And that's one way around it. But how can we empower each other to look out for each other? How can we be better bystanders? How can we educate those who aren't Asian to look out for us and not just create this culture of fear? And they came back with us not proposing bystanding stuff, but instead wanting us to fund like rape whistles that we would blow, that people in the neighborhood can blow. And to me, I was like, like I get it. Like, we need those tools, but it's not getting at structurally what needs to shift. And a lot of that is confronting the bigger issue of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, connecting our movement to other movements like Black Lives Matter and other, and basically figure out how to build communities within ourselves that is not just about, okay, we're gonna make the bad people go away, but we have to fundamentally shift things.
Yeah, and I'll add a couple of things that I think have been particularly helpful in coalition building. I think the first, and of course this is where the professor nerd would go, but it's actually really helpful, I promise, to study the history of race. Because if you do, and if you can understand, so everybody's heard the phrase that race is a social construct, but it's hard to understand what that means. Once you do, it creates a new power. And the power is that you can now see something that we are unable to see otherwise, which is how race is constantly adapting to include new people and exclude new people. It's constantly shifting historically, right? Like even if we think about how it's worked for and against Asian Americans, and you can take any group, any community, and look at not just how the social discourse has been, but actually the laws, the legal aspect of how race has been adjudicated here in the States. It tells you a lot about race. And so understanding that is critical, because what you then get out of it is an understanding of the way that race is essentially a hierarchy. And whiteness is always going to be at the top, and the rest of us are always going to be down below that. And when you're in such a structure, what you realize is, and this is what I realized through my personal experiences with racism, is it's not acceptable to be anywhere underneath the top for anyone, right? Once you've experienced racism, you don't want anyone to have to go under that. You're not willing to allow that. And so for me, recognizing that racism is a hierarchy, it's a structure, it's something that humans have created that doesn't need to exist. And it produces such suffering for all of us that we don't have to undergo, right? Like that's the crazy thing about all of this. We made it up and it's destroying us, and we're not willing to let it go. And so understanding historically how it's been produced doesn't just give us a roadmap for dismantling it. It also shows us the truth of our realities, that we are going to be stuck here until we connect with everyone else who's being affected by it.
Simran, I would say, right, like what you're not advocating for is color blindness, like, oh, race is a construct. Nah, it's nothing, right? Like there needs to be some kind of active engagement with what was created and acknowledging that some people now have privilege that others don't. And we can't just be like, okay, let's not look at it. I'm just trying to clarify or get some clarification on that. Because when people say race is a construct, I'm like, okay, and now what do we do with that? like what are the steps, right? And it does take a certain acknowledgement and not pretending then it doesn't exist, or
totally.
The people aren't left on uneven footing by these categories.
Exactly. No, I appreciate that. I think that's really important. And keeping that in mind, the other step that I've learned through coalition building is that as much as we want to think globally, as much as we want everything to change immediately, the way to really do this work is like anything else in life. It's all about relationships. And so what are the relationships you can build in your own life, in your own community? Back to what you were saying, Kristina, like what can you do in your own community to build across differences? And once you can bring these various groups to the table, there's so much more power in producing change than you can otherwise imagine. And so that I found to be incredibly effective.
Thank you both for those thoughts. What would you all say are some tensions that exist between members of APIDA communities, particularly those who were, born in the U.S. and those other communities that may have migrated or immigrated here for various reasons?
I've definitely experienced among like American-born Asians this, like, well, we did it the right way. Why can't this sort of this feeling like we did it right. These immigrants should also get here the right way, the legal way. I've seen that sort of resentment. I grew up in San Francisco, where I was not the only third generation Chinese American, in my class, and I definitely saw the first instinct to not get picked on was to find someone else to pick on, and it was usually the kid who couldn't speak English, who presented as poor, or at least cast that on them. So I definitely think there's that dynamic. I think what we deal with as Asian Americans is like, there's just so many languages, there's history that has followed us in immigration. My own grandfather wouldn't buy a Japanese car because of the relationship that he had as someone who had to flee China to Japan. And I would also say that there's sort of this disconnect, Simran, you could let me know if I'm wrong, between the South Asian experience and the East Asian experience, and we're all under this umbrella of Asian American, right? And it's definitely a political category, right? It's a way for us to find political power with each other, and yet culturally we don't have, so much in common. There's so many countries and immigrant narratives, just so many experiences all under this large umbrella.
Yeah, so it's so interesting to hear you say that, because there's definitely within Asia, right? It's so easy for us to say Asia is a category, and because we don't know Asians, it's just this it's this monolith. It's like everybody there must be the same. It's incredibly diverse, and the only way we really can break through that monolithic conception is to challenge ourselves, to meet people, and the more people we meet, the more we'll be able to see how diverse it really is. And so your point, Kristina, about the internal tensions, political tensions, totally true, right? Like you're saying I think it was your grandfather who wouldn't buy a Japanese car, like the political tensions between Indians and Pakistan. I mean, hugely tense in the South Asian context. And then there's another thing I'd want to say, which is within the South Asian psychology, collectively, there is a lot of anti-East Asian bias. There's a lot of anti-Blackness, right? And so it's a really important thing for us to acknowledge that while you and I may be advocating for an intersectional vision in which we really truly see the richness of our humanity, that's not always true within our communities, and that's something we really have to combat, right? Like I've heard so many times from people within my community who are frustrated by the Stop Asian Hate campaign, and they say, well, where were these Asians when we were getting attacked after 9/11? Why didn't anybody do a Stop Asian Hate campaign for us? And I don't think that's the conversation that I want to have, but the real conversation is, how do we actually build these relationships to a point where that category is actually meaningful and connective, as opposed to divisive in ways that it often tends to be.
Thank you both. Those are really important key components to highlight, and I know we're just a little bit over 7 o'clock, and I want to get through another question or two and then open it up. So just wanted to hear from you all. What are the historical figures that identify as Asian, Pacific Islander, Desi American that you look up to, that may not receive credit or widely known publicly for their contributions related to racial justice movements, both within the U.S. but also globally?
I've thought about this question because I have a web series called Radical Cram School, which is teaches young APIDA kids social justice, and we're working on a book proposal, and we were thinking that with each chapter we would bring up like a hero, and we noticed it's sort of the same names, sort of like Grace Lee Boggs, and this is like, most people don't even know these names because you weren't in college with me, but like Grace Lee-Bogg, Yuri Kochiyama, Richard Aoki, like, who organized with Black Panthers. Like, these are names that continually surface, but there are tons of folks, you know, who don't get lionized, I think, in the same way. And that's something that be said, because the three names I named, you probably don't even know who they are, right? I think a lot about my colleagues who are teaching Asian American studies in rural areas, and how where there are no Asian American studies programs, where there's where maybe students are forced to take them as part of some sort of diversity initiative, and they describe what it feels like for students to come in resentful, like, oh, let me just like get through this. Like, I think about those professor friends of mine and how they're doing the groundwork for, and they're maybe the only hope of sort of implanting any sense of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in those sensibilities in students who may go off and do something just unrelated to social studies. I think about a lot of the poets and performance artists and self-published memoirists who are Asian American, who I know in Los Angeles, who haven't reached mainstream acclaim, but whose stories are like so remarkable, and they work so hard to get their stuff out there. There's people don't hear about them. So these are things I'm thinking about. Simran, what about you? Who are your heroes?
I'll add two. One is Dalip Singh Sond, who is the first Asian American congressperson. He served in California from 1957 to 1963. And I think about him, one of the things that's most remarkable is I think about growing up in Texas in the 90s and how isolating it was then. I can't imagine what it must have been like for him to not just live at that time, but to reach the upper echelons of power in this country. And also at the same time remain connected to his roots. He was very involved in the decolonial efforts in his homeland of India. He was an Indian immigrant. And so he helped to get the British out of power in his homeland while serving his country here. So I love this guy and his story, and I'll drop his name in the chat in case anyone's interested in looking him up. The other one is a man named Bhagat Singh Thind, and I'll put his name in as well. He is a Sikh man who came in to the US as an immigrant, served in the World War, and then when he returned, he was denied US citizenship. And I mean, imagine how incredulous he must have been that you're willing to let me fight for you, but I can't be a citizen of your country. And he ended up filing a case, a legal case that went all the way to the US Supreme Court. And he lost the case because he wasn't white. That's what he was challenging, to be granted citizenship at a time when it was only the exclusive claim of white men to be US citizens. But his case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. So it was public. It changed the direction of this country. And later he was actually granted citizenship as he continued his fight. So both of those people are people that I really admire for what they did in this country.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing those names and histories with us. The last question I want to ask before we open up for questions, what if you can perhaps imagine what it would look like for us to celebrate and honor the culture, traditions, and contributions of APIDA communities in the US? What would that look like?
I think we need more than a month. There was a point when I was only touring in May, and I would call it Asian Pacific Nervous Breakdown Month, because I was just like, oh, this is the 1 month I get to work, and and I would be like rushing from campus to campus, like trying to like make an impact at the end of the semester. oh, so many things. In touring to different campuses, I remember touring to Bowdoin College in Maine. There was like this small Asian student group in Maine, and they were like, we're just so frustrated because we feel like when we try to engage other students, we're like either presenting food from Asia to them or dancing for them, and it's just like we've just kind of relegated ourselves to providing like a touristic experience. And I feel like so much of really spending time with this is getting into a larger political social justice history of Asian Americans here. That's more than, oh, free Panda Express at the Quad, right? And so I think it involves finding more challenging programming and having deeper, richer conversations and getting deeper into the weeds and challenging students to explore this history that's not written and write it down.
Yeah, I'd add a couple of things. So plus one to everything Kristina said. I would say one of the challenges that I think about a lot is how we learn and what we learn in our classrooms. And so this is a challenge both at the college level and at the grade school level of whose stories are we telling. And so to go back to my point earlier, why is it that we don't learn about the contributions of Asian Americans as part of American? I mean, I didn't learn that stuff until I took very specific courses in college on Asian American studies, right? Like they're segregated. Our histories are segregated, and that's not right. The only people who ends up in those classes are people who have a personal interest. And so usually you'll have Asian Americans in Asian American studies classes, you'll have Black Americans in Black studies classes. And like, who's benefiting? Like a few of us, but who's losing out? All of us, right? So like that to me is a key thing that we have to change. A second point around that of what it would look like is to think about at the college level when we have the classics, right? The classics is code for Western European thinkers, right? It's white people. This is white people's literature. So whose classics are, I mean, there is such rich literary traditions, poetic, prose, I mean, religious, you name it, in China, in India, all over the world. And so what does it look like to decolonize our understanding of the classics? Like, let's expand the canon to be more inclusive. And the last thing that I'll say, and I'm thinking about this as my kids are in preschool and they just celebrated Chinese New Year, and you know, I don't know what the right answer is for this. But they this week they celebrated Vaisakhi. Recently they celebrated the Chinese New Year. And I had a really similar experience growing up where, you know, once a year we would celebrate another culture and then move on. And what I worry about for them and what I want to resolve for all of us is, how do we not end up in a place where we do what Kristina is describing, where one day we eat, you know, takeout from Panda Express, and then we learn about Chinese history, and then we move on. Like that to me was the kind of exposure I had. And we have to figure out how to get away from that so that it's not tokenized, so that it's not dehumanizing, and that we actually develop a relationship with people as opposed to an imagined idea of who these people are. And that's so inaccurate.
All right, thank you both for those thoughts. So at this moment, we want to provide an opportunity for those in attendance to ask questions. Feel free to put your question in the chat, or if you would like to, you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly to our guests. And if nobody has questions, I do have additional questions that I haven't asked yet.
I can ask a question, just get us started a little bit. Hey, thank y'all for sharing. I learned a lot. But I guess this is a question for both of y'all. Simran, I heard you speak about how racism is foundational, foundational in America. So do you think that at any point, considering that racism is so entrenched, it is American, it is a very American concept. Do you think that at any point, sorry about the background noise, at any point we can get away from that? And if so, where does that hope come from? Like, how do you see down the line a vision of a not racist America?
Yeah, it's a question that I think about a lot, and I don't have a satisfying answer to that. Let me start there, because I'll set your expectations that you're not going to walk away from this being like, okay, cool, I know what to do, because I don't know what to do. I think this is what a lot of our conversations in this country right now are moving towards, right? Like, if you think about the conversations around defunding the police and dismantling the police, the argument essentially is this structure is inherently toxic and there's no way to reform it. We just need to end it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can make a strong case for that. I think it's compelling to say, if you look at history, right? If you read Michelle Alexander's book on the new Jim Crow, for example, and you understand the history of policing, you're like, okay, this is a racist institution inherently, and we need to figure out how to change it. And you dig a little deeper and you're like, maybe there's no way to change it. Maybe we need to start over, right? Like, that's the conversation we're having in this country right now. And we're moving towards this conversation, as you're pointing our attention to, around the nation building project itself, right? Like, what is America? This has been going on for 4 centuries, 5 centuries. Like, do we really even have a chance? Can we change? And I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that we live in a reality, right? This is not just an imagined world where we can speak in the abstract or theoretical, and people are really suffering day in and day out. And so, I mean, if you're looking at a case like Dante Wright or George Floyd, as so many of us are thinking about today and every day,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a really urgent conversation. Like, what do we do? What do we do? And I think, to me, the answer has to be we do better for today and for tomorrow. And recognizing, and this goes back to Kristina's point about race being a social construct, right? Like, we can point to as much as we want that the structures are created by humans, and we have the agency to take them down, because it's all human and we're humans and we can create something new if we want to. But at the same time, they're real and they're historical and they're entrenched and they're embedded, and we've changed as people, right? This psychology that we have now, it's not enough to just say, if we were to take down the Constitution and say, let's start over again, that doesn't mean that our minds are right yet. And so there's a double project that needs to happen. And to me, it's almost like a chicken and egg thing, right? Like, where do you start? Do you start with the people, start with the institutions? And I find myself really paralyzed by that part of the question. Kristina, it looked like you were trying to jump.
I mean, I had so many thoughts during that. And I think this pandemic has really been interesting for the world of the arts. There's a couple of movements worth looking at. One is We See You WAT, WAT.com or .org. It's We See You White American Theater. And it's a letter from BIPOC theater makers and institutions and small companies to basically wanting to dismantle the framework of American theater, which has been mostly the most well-heeled theaters with the most power tend to be mostly white institutions. And the way culture, which gets presented to the rest of the world, whether you're at the theater or not, is funneled through the theater, will mostly keep BIPOC theater makers and artists on the fringes, on the side, as sort of like, oh, look, it's the Black company. And so this is really interesting dismantling happening. And a lot of it's and theaters now who have had to contend and be contend with their racism, contend with having to figure out how to become an anti-racist institution, how to listen to the needs of BIPOC artists and their own BIPOC staff, which is interesting in things like theater companies because they tend to be nonprofit with very little money. And how do we treat everyone? Not treat everybody, but how do you create equity in a system where there's, you know, sometimes not enough resources to make things happen? So there's been a whole interesting dismantling. The other is at Los Angeles Stage Alliance, which was a service organization for all LA theaters. They do what's called the Ovation Awards, which is like the Tony Awards, but for LA theater. At their Ovation Awards, they mispronounced an Asian actress's name, put the photo of the wrong actress who was nominated, who is also Asian, and they didn't credit East West Players, which was the Asian American Theater, as co-presenters, where in the productions that they had produced, and people began to call them out on it, pulled their memberships out of the organization. The organization vowed to do better. I think they realized we're actually an organization that exists in theory and has been hobbling along and is basically held up privately by one chairman, and they folded. And so there was like a great town hall yesterday about, well, okay, we burnt it down. So what from the ashes is next? And I remember when they folded, I went, oh wow, did they have to, like, there's no contingency plan. Like, what was the plan? But there is no contingency plan. And so a lot of it is we're watching things kind of fall apart. We're watching things persist. A lot of it is capitalism. How do we dismantle capitalism, which holds a lot of this up? How do we abolish private property and things and generational wealth that will constantly keep some people at an advantage and leave other people way the hell out of ever catching up? Yeah, I don't know, but there are interesting movements and moments happening. And while burn it all down sometimes seems really drastic, I do feel like we're doing a slow-mo version of that because it's hard to burn down the house that we're literally living in, even if it's a shell of a house or temporary housing or, you know, whatever this analogy is. Oh yes, Demetrius, you're saying yes. The film industry too is also having a huge reckoning, and we saw this. I think Golden Globes and different award ceremonies are like quickly like playing catch up. Oh, we're not racist, and like we're gonna hire even the royal family, right? We're watching them having to contend with we're not racist. Like, you're literally the British monarchy. Like, how can you not be racist? Hello, like, why do they speak English in all these countries? It's you. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be a lot of jobs, I think, for diversity consultants, but I think that's sort of the slow-mo version of burning it all down. But maybe stuff needs to be burnt down a little faster. But it's tricky because we're all in it, right?
Yeah, thank y'all for your responses. It's definitely something I grapple with too all the time because I never know. But thank y'all.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And you know, I'll add to that, you know, just to pick up on what Kristina was saying at the end. One of the lessons I've learned through activism is it's really easy to point our fingers at things that are wrong. You know, calling out is easy, and critiquing is easy, and that's what we learn to do in school even. The really difficult thing is to build. And so part of the project of creating something new is actually imagining what a new world is like. And that's where I spend a lot of my time. And I love when young activists are thinking in that way, right? Like, sure, burn it down, right? You don't like it looking. I have no problem with burning it down, but then what are you actually creating? And I think that's where our energy should be really focused.
Yeah, I totally agree. As an artist, I feel like we can cancel things it's really interesting how people are just discovering America's Next Top Model and all these shows. And it was like, yeah, I remember watching that going, wow, that's crazy. And everyone's like, ah! And I'm like, oh man, don't open an American history book. It's gonna get really bad. Like, but what can we build forward, right? tearing stuff down, we can tear stuff down all day long. It's so much harder to build, and it's so much harder to have an imagination around it. And it's not saying that those who haven't been building don't have an imagination, but we literally have never really seen equity, right? And so we have to like kind of figure this out. We know how to take things apart.
So there's a question in the chat, and you all, I think, begin to speak to this from Denise. It says, can you talk about examples of student activism and its place in history and current movements? Then I think next we'll go to Angelo, because I think Angelo has a hand raised.
Cool.
Much. Yeah, you should take that one. I have some examples, but you're the historian.
Well, I'll talk more about contemporary stuff. I mean, one of the things that I've seen through activism, and this is even speaking from my own experience, is activism as a student has a major contribution to make at varying levels, and it also is a training ground for getting into the activism scene. And the best justice workers that I know started as students. And they've been in the game for a long time, and they've learned along the way how to be effective. And so there's a real strong case to be made for student activism. And I'll give you one of the strongest that I've seen. I work with Everytown for gun safety. And they just had an event here in New York City, where I live, that was led by Students Demand Action. And as I was standing there with them, it was a small event because of, COVID restrictions and all that. But as I was reflecting on the Parkland kids, who's, you'll all remember them. And it's kind of interesting. I don't even really have to say much more besides the Parkland kids, and people know who I'm talking about. And one of the most refreshing things about seeing their activism was how sincere it was, right? So on the one hand, you have the NRA and its supporters, a mass shooting happens and everyone tweets out thoughts and prayers. And we all sort of roll our eyes because we're like, that doesn't mean anything. It's not sincere. There's no change being made. And the flip side to that is the student activism and how sincere those kids were. They poured their hearts for several years afterwards, not just to ensure their own safety, but for everyone, right? And they were really passionate about the cause. And like, I don't care. I don't care what cause you care about. Like, there are certain things we probably disagree on, and like, that's cool. But what's touching to me, what I love, is seeing people who are passionate about their activism and putting their hearts and souls into it. And that's really different than a lot of the performative stuff that we see either online when we just tweet and announce something, or even, in our classrooms, often we'll say things just to get points from our friends, right? Like, that person is cool because they have this progressive perspective or whatever. And so the sincerity behind the activism really means something, and it prepares you in a different way to do more within the world.
I'll jump in and say that when I was a UCLA student, and I was very privileged that I got to go to a campus that had such a rich activist culture, to the point that I could take it for granted that someone would pull the ship along if I couldn't do it. But I remember being quite jaded and thinking, like, what is this going to do? We're in a building on this enclosed campus, yelling. What does it do? And it actually does a lot, because as someone who works in the arts, and people, well, what does that do, Kristina? You did a show for a few people. It's shifting culture. If you can shift the culture of that campus, you can shift the culture of the rest of the world, and hopefully shift the culture of policymakers. And one great example is, for gay marriage to get passed to the Supreme Court, it took culture shifting first. It took all these gay characters on TV and more conversations and famous people, just like coming out, and those kind of shifts to happen. And finally, the last lever to move was the Supreme Court going, yeah, I guess it would be unconstitutional that we wouldn't let same-sex couples marry. So you can underestimate the power of culture, symbolic gestures. I mean, I have to tell myself this as someone in neighborhood council who has like this much power to recommend, you know, something that what you're doing is that small seed that hopefully leads to that bigger lever, right, of laws and bigger institutional change.
I guess for our final question of the evening, let's see, Angelo, you have your hand.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so I want to say thank you guys for showing up, and I really appreciate you guys being here. My questions kind of comes from Eleanor Ostrom, who was the first female Nobel laureate in economics. So my question is, do you believe the shift after World War II from relatively high citizen participation in local government to dismal levels now, the continued view of citizens as passive agents who receive public goods from the federal and state levels rather than being active agents involved in their own governance, and in the same vein as viewing democracy only as something we participate in when we go to the voting booth, have anything to do with the continued underrepresentation of those that identify as BIPOC and the continued violence we see against these groups?
I think what I'm witnessing from where I am in Los Angeles is something quite different. I am seeing a lot of activism, a lot of people who are activists running for office, who are doing the door knocking and the text banking and all that kind of stuff. So that I will say, as someone who was elected, who used to be like, let me just complain about it from a stage and tweet at you until you give up, that all the pressure and shaming you do of your politicians is one thing, but you actually do, I think, as pain in the ass as the job is, we need to be running for office. And you can scream at politicians all day long, but they're also navigating a system that I feel like is made for you to like give up and just rubber stamp stuff. So it's really tricky to make change in this like long, and it's democracy, right? It's like checks and balances, and it's set up so that one person doesn't, we kind of, we were testing that the last 4 years, but that one person doesn't drag everything dramatically in the other direction. Other checks and balances. So I'm seeing something different from my POV in terms of I'm not witnessing that same kind of apathy. And I think the last few years actually has activated a whole new wave of people of color and women and non-binary folks to run for public office.
Yeah, I would agree with your perspective, Kristina, where we are seeing the numbers are indicating record turnout across the board in terms of participation in elections. Now, could there be more engagement? Yes, of course, always. Is there a need for a shift in public consciousness in the way that we think about what it means to be a citizen, to be involved in civic participation? Yeah, I think so. I think for my generation, at least, growing up, it was pretty easy to check out and not care. And you know, growing up, I didn't care. You know, I cared about my friends and my family, but was I interested in politics? Like not in the way that young people are today. And so, you know, these things, if we look at the numbers historically, and I think you're sort of intimating this as you speak, Angelo, like these numbers come and go in waves. And what really moves people to get involved is urgency, right? If you feel the heat of the fire on your neck, as so many of us do right now from all different identity groups, you're going to be moved into action, right? Because it's a matter of survival. And so the question then becomes, how can we get ourselves into a mindset where we're not reacting, right? Again, like when we're reacting, it's usually too late by that point. Right, scientists say that when you're dehydrated, when you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. It's too late at that point, right? Your body's already been affected. The same thing with this stuff. If we're waiting to get involved, if we're waiting to really put in the effort until it matters and it hits home, then we're never going to get there, and we're always going to be reacting. And so I think for me, what I'd love to see, and this is what we talk about in the diversity and inclusion world, like how can we set the conditions so that we don't have to get to the point where that fire is on our neck? That should be the question we're asking ourselves. What does it look like for activism to be proactive rather than reactive? That's what we should be trying to do.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your insight, your wisdom, your experiences with us this evening. I know that we're, of course, not in person, so we can't do a audible clap or round of applause, but if you all would use your interactive tools via Zoom to just express our appreciation to Christina and Simran for what they offered to us this evening. This session is being recorded, and so we will make it available for those who registered but wasn't able to attend. We hope that you would join us for the remainder of our APIDA Heritage Month event